Welcome to the Annaley Naegle Red Lecture by the Charles Red Center for Western Studies. My name is Jay Buckley, and I'm the director of the center. We're excited to have so many faculty and students and members of the Red Center board and the families that support the Red Center and the board members joining us. We'll first have a prayer by J. Gordon Daines III, and then I'll introduce the lecturer, and my associate director, Brendan, will introduce our speaker. Charlie and Annaley Red and their family helped found this center 51 years ago. And so this lecture is named in the honor of Charlie's wife, Annaley. She was a prominent southeastern Utah rancher and philanthropist. She was born in the Latter-day Saint colonies in Mexico in 1910. Her family was forced to leave Mexico 2 years later during the Mexican Revolution. Once back in the United States, her father provided no support, materially or emotionally, to Annaley and her mother, who was a plural wife, even when the families lived in the same town. Despite these economic hardships, she graduated from high school and completed a normal school education degree at Brigham University. She taught school in LaSalle, Utah, where she met and married Charlie Red. She worked as a partner in their cattle company, including the duties of cook, storekeeper, and secretary. When bankers came to foreclose on the ranch during the 1930s, Annaley's famous cooking, especially her prairie fire beans, helped save the ranch. Charlie suffered a stroke in 1972, and Annaley cared for him until his death 4 years later. Annaley had a love of family and of history. She and Charlie raised 8 children. She purchased her family home, a historic winery in Tokerville, Utah, and restored it. She belonged to literary clubs and enjoyed reading, and passed away in August of 2000. So we welcome you to the Annaley Naegle Red Lecture. Now we'll have an introduction of our speaker by Brendan Ransing.
Our speaker today is Dr. Sasha Reed, a research ecologist with the United States Geological Survey, stationed at the Southwest Biological Science Center in Moab, Utah. She earned a PhD in ecology from the University of Colorado at Boulder and did a postdoc at the University of Montana in Stanford. She's published over 150 peer-reviewed papers, has received millions upon millions of dollars in research funding, and has co-led and co-authored national reports, such as the State of the Carbon Cycle Report and the National Climate Assessment. And she helped inform the USGS's role in national efforts, such as those with greenhouse gas monitoring. She's won numerous awards for her research, including having President Barack Obama present her with the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. I first met Sasha at a conference in Moab a few years back on cryptobiotic soil crusts, a topic about which I knew absolutely nothing. And she led a field trip down to Canyonlands to show us some great examples of these soil crusts. And her enthusiasm was really contagious, and I found myself geeking out over what I otherwise would have assumed was just some dry, dark-looking dirt. I've tried to share that excitement with my kids as we've been hiking in the desert, and I show them these soil crusts, and I don't think I've quite conveyed the excitement as she has, which is exactly why I was excited to invite her to speak to us today. She's very good at conveying her scientific knowledge to public audiences and helping us understand some of the really complex things that are going on with science and management in our regional environments. So join me with welcoming Dr. Sasha Reed.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to move around a little bit if that's okay. I get kind of nervous behind the podium. I'm so delighted to be here today and to be talking to all of you about hope in these times of change. And there's three things I kind of want us to keep in mind while we're talking together today, or while I'm talking near you today. And one is that, as Brendan said, I am a scientist for the U.S. Geological Survey. That means I work for all of you. We do science for the people. So I hope you'll never hesitate to reach out to me with questions if you want to hear more, if you have ideas on ways we can do hopeful science. The second is, as you heard, I'm a biogeochemist, so I'm kind of a detective who sleuths around looking creepily for carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, looking at in the atmosphere, in the plants, and in the soil. And you might wonder why a biogeochemist is talking to you about hope. And that's kind of a good question. And I don't know if you've ever given a talk like this, but usually you're invited to give your title many months before you have to give the talk. And so you come up with something that maybe you're not really thinking about too much. And I think this was the title of the talk I wanted someone to give. I wanted to hear about hope in these times of change. And so in the months in between giving that title and the talk, I've put together what I hope we will find a useful idea of how science can inform management and our own decision making, all of us, in the context of solutions, of meeting challenges together, and of hope. And the third thing is, I'm so delighted that this talk is in honor of Annaley Red. And I had the privilege of being able to talk to her son Robert and her grandson Matt, and the joy that was so innate within her, so clearly, even in the face of the challenges we just heard about her facing, that joy, that belief in that hard work and the natural world can come together to mean something to us. I feel like that's the perfect context for all of us in thinking about these issues that we face today. So with that, I'll get us started. I do want to note that I've put here, if you can see it, the number slide we're on and the total number of slides we have. We scientists can talk forever, and I know it can be hard to pay attention the whole time, so I thought this information could help you apportion your attention appropriately. You'll know where we are at all times. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit is the context of the challenges that I think we face with climate change. I want to tell three short vignettes about climate change, one about a warming climate, one about flood, and one about fire. And then I want to end with thinking about hope and what we can do to build our hope in these challenging times, actual things we can think about and do in this context. So I want to give you my take-home messages right up front so you can be thinking about them throughout. I think there is totally hope. I think there's lots of hope for our amazing species to meet these challenges that we face. I think science has really cool, powerful tools to help us think of solutions in the face of change. And I think people are the key. We are the problem, we are the solution, we are everything. And by working together, we can really come up with creative ways to tackle some of these problems if we do it together. I want to let you know that I know things are challenging right now. We have lots of extreme events in the news constantly. Hurricanes, floods, fire, our bodies of water at their lowest point as we've ever recorded them, really hot temperatures, incredible amounts of snow. We are seeing changes that are important to recognize and that can be worrisome. Here we have temperature change that's occurred over 100 years in the western US. Here's us in Utah. We can see things getting warmer. Here's where I live in Moab, a hot spot of warming. Moab, if you've been there, is a place that can already be pretty hot. So moving to even warmer conditions makes us worry about the living things that live there, including me. I get really hot in the summer. Here we have another study that looked at warming from a similar period of time, and it parsed who did the most warming over that 126 years by county. Number 2, Grand County, Utah. That's the county that I live in. Of all the counties in the country, it's warmed the most. So thinking about this changes in temperature, what they mean for ecosystems, economies, people, infrastructure, it can feel like a big challenge. We also know that in these dry places here in Utah, we've seen a lot of drought. We're in multi-decadal drought. We're getting out of it, we hope. This snow has been incredible, right? But we know that things are getting dry. Even in the face of not changing precipitation, because things are getting warmer, there's more evaporation and more transpiration, so we can end up with drier conditions. That worries us in places that are already dry. And so we can feel these effects. This is the Pack Creek fire that happened in Moab, a huge fire we saw for town over a long time. We had big floods this summer. And we know we can directly feel the effects of these floods on our vehicles, in our houses, on our lives. Here's Provo, Utah flood. And we see ecosystems responding to these changes too. This is massive die-off events of pinyon trees in New Mexico. That's thought to be because of global change type drought or hot drought, that we're reaching conditions that our trees are finding it hard to survive in. We're seeing a lot of trees dying near Moab now too. And it affects us emotionally as well. Studies have shown that over 2/3 of Americans feel some level of climate anxiety. And a study of 10,000 young people across the world said nearly 50% feel climate anxiety daily. That's really hard. That's a lot to carry around, that anxiety. So it's not just having the potential to affect our ecosystems and our infrastructure and our societies, but to affect us emotionally too. And that's where I think hope comes in, to help combat some of this anxiety and to get us thinking creatively about solutions. So these are 3 books that I used in between the time I gave the title and decided what to talk about, and I think they're books that you guys might enjoy if you're interested in reading more about hope in the context of climate change. These are the people who gave me the books: my best friend Tanya Troxler, a wonderful collaborator and friend at the U.S. Geological Survey, Daniel Winkler, and Catherine Hayhoe, who's an incredible climate change communicator, thinks really beautifully about the good ways religion and climate change science merge together. Really worth checking out her positive, hopeful conversations. And so with each of these books, this book here about coral reefs, which we know are having a really hard time with climate change, here thinking about the hope of our species, even in the face of losing other species from the planet, and then thinking explicitly about climate change and how we talk about climate change. And just a little quote from each of the books: "Without hope, all is lost. It's a crucial survival trait." I think that's true. This can be a complicated world. It can feel overwhelming at times. And hope is a trait of our species that we use in lots of different ways to get up in the morning and find a way to meet those challenges. I once heard that hope and grief are 2 sides of the same coin. Grief comes from looking back at mistakes, and hope can be found only by looking forward. I really like that. She's talking about coral reefs and the loss of coral reefs, but also opportunities to sustain them and bring them back, even in the face of change. We can grieve things that we've lost, but hope allows us to look forward and move forward, and science can help us think of those ways to move forward. The single most important thing that anyone can do about climate change: talk about it. We don't have to have the same opinions about politics. We don't have to have the same opinions about other things, but we probably agree on lots of stuff that joins us together. We can come together on climate change and talk openly, and the more we talk about it, the more solutions that we'll be able to come up with, and the less anxiety I think we'll feel in some of these challenges. So the first story I want to tell you is about Indian ricegrass, one of my favorite plants, Achnatharum hymeneoides. It's a really important grass in the Southwest. It's really important for wildlife, really important for livestock, and really important for a number of cultural benefits for tribes and other indigenous groups that rely on the plant and have an important connection with the plant. So it's a species that we care about greatly. Work by Seth Munson and the National Park Service showed that when they monitored the cover of grasses like Indian ricegrass, which is also sometimes called a cool season grass or a C3 grass, in warmer years there was less cover of those grasses, and we didn't see those same patterns with shrubs. meaning that the grasses seem to be negatively affected by those warming temperatures in ways other kinds of plants weren't. And so we wanted to get together with land managers to better understand what those patterns might mean and what we could do about them to join the science that can inform management with action on the landscape. And so we came up with all of our concerns, all of the opportunities. And one of the things that got discussed at this meeting was the idea of assisted migration, that we might have to give up on certain species and go to other species. And as you can imagine, for those of us who live in the places and for the managers who work hard to sustain those communities, that's an upsetting thought, to give up on a species and bring in other species. And there are complications that can be associated with that. So we really wanted to dive in. Do we know enough about the species we have to give up on them yet? And we said, no, we don't. And so work by Liz Ballinger, a National Park Service scientist based out of Moab, Utah. Liz got together with National Park Service, and don't worry about reading this, I'm sorry that I see people like, oh my gosh. But these are different species, and Liz grouped them with other managers to say, what kind of plants are they? Do they have cultural significance? Do they have ecological significance? How common are they? How worried are we about them in these changing climates? And what came back was that Indian ricegrass across the Southwest was the #1 species that people wanted to manage better and not lose on their landscapes. So we did a climate manipulation experiment started by Jane Belknap, another amazing US Geological Survey scientist who I believe is a BYU grad, did a lot of fantastic biological soil crust work. She set up this climate manipulation, and you're looking at a drone picture here, looking down on these plots. You can see these kind of 6-foot by 4-foot plots all over this landscape. And we have lots of climate treatments in these plots, and some of them are warming. So we're using infrared lamps to warm the plants and the biocrusts and the soils in a way that lets us get a lens into what we might expect in the future for those communities in a warming world. And you can see here the unwarmed plot next to the warmed plot in winter to prove to you that that warming is working. Daniel Winkler was able to show for Indian ricegrass that in the unwarmed plots there was more. So here's the unwarmed and the warmed. This is how much cover. So the higher the number here, the more cover of that species in the plot, the more of that plant. There was definitely more in the unwarmed than the warmed. So that really linked with Seth's observational data that suggested a decline in that type of plant with warming. What Daniel was also able to show was that photosynthesis rates here in April in the unwarmed versus the warmed, here in May in the unwarmed versus the warmed, that the photosynthesis, which is how plants get their food, that was reduced with warming. And that gave us an idea of the mechanism that could be driving those changes, that reduced cover. But there were Indian ricegrass plants living in the warmed plots. And so we wanted to look at them. Were they super wilty and sad with yellow leaves and no seeds? No, they were huge. They were awesome. They were like, life has never been better for us. And so you can see here, they had many more photosynthetic parts and way more than double the size of the plants in the unwarmed plots. And there's a lot of reasons that could be. It could be that they're just genetically better prepared for a warmer world. We're all a little different genetically. They might just have better survival in a warmer world. It could be that they're not competing with as many of their same kind, so there's more resources available for them. It could be that these plants were born into a warmer world. We know that's the case because this experiment has been going on for so long. It could be that that mom plant prepared the seeds to be more successful for a warmer world, to be adapted. And so we're trying to figure out what the reason is, because that's a really hopeful outcome. If we see that there are certain individuals that are better adapted, or that if we can grow seeds under warmer conditions, grow them somewhere warmer, and that species that's so important to us can then be very well adapted for the climate not only of today but for tomorrow, that means we wouldn't have to give up on Indian ricegrass. We just have to find the right individuals to sustain that community. So there's lots of cool work happening on plants and seeds in Utah to try to better understand what our opportunities are. Lots of science from these really happy-looking people who are hopeful about what we have to offer. And formal science isn't the only way that we know. There have been people successfully growing plants in a wide-ranging climate for a long time. And so I want to show you a little video and then talk for a second about it.
Conventional agriculture does everything by mechanics. You have 14-year-old planters, herbicide applications, pesticide applications, a lot of that runs off and contaminates things downstream. With Hopi agriculture, we don't use any of that stuff. Hopi is one of the very few places I know where we plant corn to fit the environment, not manipulate the environment to fit the corn. Dryland farming means that basically you don't need irrigation. These are like super seeds, you know, they're very tough, you know, they're like us, and so they survive like us. The title of my presentation is Indigenous Agricultural Knowledge, Barrier Policy, and Integration and Outreach. This corn is rare because you can put it down 2 feet deep and it'll still come up. We've been in this part of the country for 1,000 years. We know how to manage natural resources.
I highly recommend this movie if you haven't seen it yet. We showed it last fall at the Moab Festival of Science. Please come to our festival. We can send you information. We have it every year. It's pretty awesome. And it is available too. So if it hasn't played yet at BYU, I bet it's something that would be easy to get. And it's telling us about how traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous people knowledge, has so much to offer in terms of solutions in the face of climate change. There's a lot of information that hasn't been integrated or incorporated or well respected enough yet that we can use to better understand these systems and what our options are. So you made it through the first part, and that's the longest part, so you're doing awesome. And the take-home messages are, nature is resilient. We have a lot of options to think about in the face of change. Science is one of the tools in our species toolbox to better understand what the challenges are and what options to face them can be. Research that focuses not only on the problems we face, but the solutions too, is not only powerful in being able to help us think about the future, but is way better for mental health. I studied just the problems for a long time, and it can really get you down. But joining that with thinking about solutions can be a really spectacular way to keep your day bright and also move forward in trying to help the world. And that we need diverse teams. We need lots of different kinds of people sitting at the table from different backgrounds with different perspectives. Not only is that the world that I want to live in, but that's where real solutions that can work across scale are going to come from. I want to think for a minute now, not about heat, but about floods. We know that extreme events are happening. It feels like they're on the news all the time. Another flood, another fire, another huge snowstorm with 12 feet of snow. And that there's lots of kinds of extreme events that seem to be increasing in frequency. In Moab this summer, we had insane floods. Really, really big. You can just see we had lots of parts of town closed, huge areas filled with sediment, infrastructure broken down. This is the last video. I got really into videos. But this is a car. This is at Mill Creek. It's a stream you can usually jump across that's carrying a vehicle downstream because that's how much water is increasing. At this time of this flood, this Mill Creek flows into the Colorado River in Moab. The cubic feet per second, the flow of Mill Creek was greater than the Colorado River. This is an enormous amount of water moving through ecosystems and moving through our town. And there were a lot of after effects of this. Lots of destruction, lots of debris pushed up against bridges, dirt, huge piles of dirt everywhere. Things that I didn't think of that would be happening. And it brought people together. People came out, they grabbed a shovel if they had one, they grabbed equipment if they had it, they walked to downtown, they walked to their neighbor's house and they said, how can I help you get out of all of this sediment? And they were talking about change, talking about opportunities to address that change. It was like beautiful. And so these challenges that we face are opportunities too, opportunities to bring us together and to think about how we move forward with action that benefits all of us and our ecosystems. It also represents an ecological opportunity. So these are people who study invasive species and riparian zones and who do a lot of work in Moab for restoration. This is the riparian corridor after the stream went down. This used to be a forest of invasive plants. Just huge, thick invasive plants. And that flood washed them all away in a way that millions of dollars and paid people would not be able to do. So it was a problem, but it's an opportunity too. If we were ready to plant native plants in the riparian zone right after this flood, we could use this cleared space as a way to reset the course of that riparian zone. So it's not that floods aren't a challenge, but we shouldn't just see them as a problem. They present opportunities socially and ecologically. So big changes mean we can't do things the way we did it before, and that our shared problems can bring us together to think creatively about solutions, because it's not just a problem but an opportunity, which I think is true about a lot of stuff in life. Fire, the last story I want to tell you, is thinking about fire. We know that fire is increasing in the western United States. Part of that has to do with invasive grasses like cheatgrass and bufflegrass. Part of it has to do with our world getting drier. So this figure is showing time on the horizontal axis, and then the millions of acres burned in the western US on this vertical axis. This is what scientists think is the amount of fire that would have occurred no matter what. And this orange is the extra fire that scientists think is happening because we're in a drier world with climate change. And what you can see here in the figure of the right, this is how dry or arid the burned fuel is, and this is how much fire there is. And this is intuitive. A dry forest is going to burn more than a wet forest. And so what we see here is that how dry the forest is really determines how much burns. And in these drier, more recent years, we're seeing more fire. So we have more fire happening across the landscape. I want to tell you about a project started by Tova Spector, who was with the National Park Service and is now with the U.S. Forest Service. And this is Mesa Verde National Park, a national park in southwestern Colorado. And you don't need to read these words, but these colored polygons are fires that have occurred in Mesa Verde National Park in recent years. And so before these fires, Mesa Verde was mostly old growth pinyon juniper forest. And now this is becoming a rare ecosystem type in Mesa Verde, and we have these burned areas that fill with invasive grasses instead. So we're seeing big changes to Mesa Verde and to Ute Mountain Ute land, which is south of Mesa Verde National Park. So we developed a project together to understand the consequences of this fire, because the land managers aren't seeing pinyon and juniper baby plants come back. And they're wondering if they will come back after fire and what it would take to help them come back. And one of the things that I love about this project is that from the beginning, we worked as a team, the managers and the scientists, to come up with the questions, to come up with the approach. So looking at so many young faces here as you're starting on science careers potentially, don't forget to reach out to manager partners or decision-making partners or the general public to talk about your work, to let it inform your questions and your approach. Because not only will your science be more relevant and usable, you'll end up communicating in a way that vastly increases the chance that it will be used. And it's just fun. So we came up with this project to think about pinyon juniper. This is the western United States, Oregon, California, Arizona. This is where pinyon juniper is. It's an enormous land type in the western United States. And it's one that, at least for me, I used to take for granted. Oh, camp over here in the pinyon juniper, whatever. Didn't think of it as necessarily a very important kind of ecosystem, but it really is. It has huge cultural power for a lot of different types of communities. It has lots of plant and animal species that need, or they're called either obligate or semi-obligate. They can't survive without pinyon juniper, or they need it for key aspects of their life cycle. So pinyon juniper ecosystems are really important ecosystems in the West. And the idea that they might be struggling to come back with fire, while at the same time we know there's more fire, is concerning. So the project that we developed was to try to study our intact pinyon juniper ecosystems in Mesa Verde and on Mountain Ute land, also to look at these ecosystems that had been thinned. So one of the ways that we try to reduce the likelihood of stand replacing fire is to thin trees. We remove trees to try to lessen the chance that that fire is going to carry through the ecosystem. But that thinning can have unintended consequences for the pinyon juniper systems too. And then these burned areas that are now just grasslands, they don't have pinyon juniper coming back. We wanted to ask questions about what's different about those ecosystems so that we could use that to inform management options to improve the chance that pinyon juniper could come back. So we hypothesized that the intact pinyon juniper would be cooler and wetter, that they would have a lot more of those rare plant species that the managers are concerned about. They would have lots of fungal symbionts. So one of the awesomest things we've been learning in ecology for the last few decades is how plants really need these below ground fungal mycorrhizal partners to be able to survive. Maybe after fire those partners aren't there, and that's part of why we're not seeing the pinyon juniper come back. We also thought that there'd be higher soil health, and that this would go down. Some of these things would be reduced by our thinning, and then those things would be the lowest in the place where the burning had occurred. We also wanted to do a restoration experiment where we manipulated some of these things that we thought were important. We manipulated the microclimate, whether or not the fungal partners were there, the health of the soil, so that we could see, can we see a difference if we plant these seedlings? So this is work by Jillian Trimber, a graduate student at Northern Arizona University, who grew hundreds of pinyon and juniper babies. You can see the pinions here if they aren't the cutest little things. And here they are planted. So we planted them out in a burned site in Mesa Verde National Park. We gave some of them their fungal symbionts, others didn't. We planted some of them under nurse plants that we thought might help them, others we didn't. Some of them out of the open, some of them next to downed wood, things that managers thought they might have as tools to be able to promote pinyon juniper babies if we could figure out what worked. I don't have the data for that yet because we just did it this fall. But from the part of the study where we looked at the different ecosystem types, the intact pinyon juniper, the thinned, and the burned, what we did find when we looked for pinyon juniper babies that came up on their own, these bars are the data for the intact old growth pinyon juniper. So these are sapling, they're kind of like young but not baby plants, and we saw the same thing for the seedlings, the more baby plants. And what we saw here was there was lots of, this is the juniper and the hatched bars, lots of baby junipers, lots of baby pinions at these 3 different sites that were near these fires with the name at the bottom. When we looked for the seedlings and the saplings where the burn had occurred, we didn't find any. 0. The data are here, they just don't show up because there's none to show. When we looked at the thinning, there were 2 very types of thinning that had occurred in these landscapes. One was a milder form of thinning, the trees were removed. The other was more extensive, really cutting down almost all the trees, and they chipped the trees and put the wood out. And we saw big differences. There were many more pinyon juniper babies coming back after this thinning in this intermediate treatment than in this more extreme treatment. And this is hopeful because it means we have to be able to thin. Land managers have to reduce the chance of stand replacing fire to protect people and infrastructure and ecosystems, but that there could be a sweet spot of thinning where we can do that, reduce the chance of fire, but not have too many unintended consequences on other parts of the system, like the ability of new pinyon and juniper to grow back. So we can refine our understanding of how we can perform this management action, but not have too much of an effect that we're looking not to have at the same time. We're now building the study to also bring in some of the cultural and wildlife components. How are these changed ecosystems interacting with the other kinds of organisms and with the people on these landscapes? And then to think about how places that have changed can teach to places that haven't. So Anna Vaughn, another graduate student at Northern Arizona University, is a social scientist, and she's doing a study to talk to land managers in places that have seen big change, like Mesa Verde National Park, like Bandelier National Monument that had all of the pinyon juniper die-off that I showed you in that early picture, and to say, what would you do differently if you knew now what you didn't know then, or if you knew then what you know now, and how can we bring that information to managers who haven't seen change yet in their systems, but maybe are worried about change on the horizon, that exchange of knowledge and understanding. And so the take-homes from this is that climate can have a lot of different components, land management, climate change, that these different kinds of change can interact in ways that are important for us to understand. That projects that the users of information co-develop with the creators of information can be really powerful in coming up with solutions. And that these systems are changing fast in a way that might mean what we did in the past is harder to keep doing, and we have to come up with new ways to act on the landscape. So to end, as Brendan said, I'm a biogeochemist. This is the carbon cycle, and we're not going to go into it, so don't get scared, but it's just how I think about a cycle. We have carbon in soils and plants. That's a microbe, obviously. And that carbon can be released into the atmosphere, and then it comes back down. And maybe you've heard us talking about carbon sequestration, climate mitigation, which is really us just trying to use a lot of tools to better understand the carbon cycle. Oh, there's all these complicated parts, but what we want to do is just plump in, fatten up this part of the curve. We don't want to stop the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is life. It has to cycle. But we want carbon to spend more time in this lower part of the curve, so it's spending less time in the atmosphere, influencing our climate. I think there's a hope cycle too. And this is the Jane Goodall book that talks so beautifully about hope. Doesn't really call it a cycle, but she's talking about how hope is our background state. Being hopeful is we can see possibilities. It's our evolutionary advantage, as she said. And then we go and we spend these times in a hopeless state, but we come back to our background state. And so what I think is that we want to plump the hopeful side of this cycle in these times of change. So how do we do that? I think a lot of studies show that if you're feeling anxiety about anything, getting out and doing something about it is a way to make yourself feel better. Even if it's a small drop in the bucket, even if it's doing more recycling or being the person who turns all the lights out at your house if someone's not in the room, or volunteering, any of those things can make you feel like you're taking action and can give you hope. It's also, even if it's a small drop in a bucket, a lot of small drops fill a bucket. And so if we all start doing more, we will have seeable, measurable effect. To build relationships and partners, whether it be with land managers or your family, your friends, your church, other groups, whatever feels right to you, but build those partnerships and talk about the changes openly. We might not agree about them, but sharing our concerns lifts some of that burden and brings hope into our hearts in a way that can really combat that anxiety. Promote diversity whenever you're able to. Having lots of people at the table. Help support there being people with different perspectives, backgrounds. Let them in, welcome them in, because that's going to help us come up with the most creative and innovative solutions. And try actively to regulate your own hope cycle to your best ability. Things that give me hope, that I use to activate and regulate my hope cycle, we know we can affect climate because we already did. We know we have the ability to regulate biogeochemistry in a way that has outcomes to atmospheric chemistry and our climate, and that's hopeful. Ecosystems are resilient. It doesn't mean that they don't need our help and that we don't want to think critically about how to sustain and maintain things, but they have a lot of inherent resilience that we can take advantage of. Science as a tool in our toolbox has a lot of solutions to offer that we can continue to use. We have to move away from the status quo, and that gives us the chance to rethink a lot of things in an exciting way. We need diversity, which is awesome for so many reasons, and really cool things are happening. Nature-based solutions, climate mitigation, carbon sequestration, awesome things are happening on the landscape. We are a very hopeful, resilient species who's making cool moves in these fronts. So don't feel hopeless, because hopelessness, I think, allows us to not take action. I don't want the hope to be Pollyanna, let's just smile while the Titanic sinks, but we do have opportunities to enact change, and hope is what we need to be able to find the motivation to do that, to move forward, to look forward. These organizations give me lots of hope. Universities, federal agencies that manage resources, federal agencies that do science, nonprofit, but most of all, what gives me hope is people. The people that I have the privilege to work with, the people that I'm looking at right now, there's so much hope. And when I'm feeling down and blue and I don't want to get out of bed, it's people and what we're capable of that I think of. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'm really glad that I got to be here with you today. I don't know, can I take questions?
Yes.
Awesome. Ask me.
Please state their question back.
Okay. Ask me anything, yes.
So with problems and solutions and the general public getting engaged, what experience have you had with real traction for the urban populations, the people who never really get out, the people who are maybe more living in virtual realms than in concrete, real places?
Awesome. So great question. And it was with thinking about problems and solutions, how do we engage people who maybe aren't out in the world in a way that would make them already thinking about kind of sustaining ecosystems? Is that a fair representation? So that's an excellent question. And I think I grew up in New York, a lot of my family are those people. I could come outside and like a rock falls and they run and think it's for sure a bear that's going to come and get them. And so I think engaging with those people, as with lots of people, is about sharing experience and finding common ground where we do. So they can care very deeply about ecosystems or about climate mitigation or about there being wild places, even if they don't go into those wild places. Finding for each group or person what matters to them, what do we share, and then talking on that foundation, I think I find the most valuable. I think when you talk about how amazing organisms, so we talked about biological soil crust. Does everybody know what biocrusts are here? They're like a little surface photosynthetic community that lives on the top of the soil in places like drylands where soils see the sun. And so people think about it and they're like, yeah, whatever, biocrusts. But as soon as you start talking about how amazing biocrusts are, people who have never seen them and who maybe will never see them get really excited. And so I think sharing your joy, finding ways to communicate the importance of what it is that you're talking about, not only in general, not like lots of acronyms and big words that no one's going to understand, but also finding that common ground of communication. What do you care about? And can I link what I care about with what you care about in a way that we move forward together? Probably. And so I think we see a lot of change. I do a lot of talks for nonprofit organizations that have a lot of people who live in urban places and who are virtually attending the talk. And they just seem really excited about it by the end. And I think that's because of finding a way to connect with groups of people. Humans like to get excited about amazing things, and we like to take care of stuff that we believe matters. And so being able to join those things together and talking to people, it's a great question. Other questions? Yes?
I notice you don't have the Forest Service listed among your agencies there. Is there some reason for that?
Excellent question. It's about to change. So this is our agencies that have either provided funding for the science or who have helped co-develop the science. So it's not that I don't think those are very important groups, but they just haven't yet paid for any of the work or joined in for any of the work. But we're starting a new project now with the Forest Service, so the next time we get together, you'll be able to see the Forest Service. But this acknowledgements, and I'm really glad you asked, is, and I should have repeated the question, why is the Forest Service or other groups missing from this? This slide are really people that actively participated in the stories that I told you or provided funding for that. So thank you for asking that. I think all the other agencies are really important too. And I had the Forest Service on my hope slide, so great question. Yes?
I was wondering if you could share if there are any other unusual or unexpected sources of hope, like you shared how the flood might have helped as well, or in partnerships, where are these unusual or unexpected places?
Oh, great question. So the question is, could I share kind of other examples of where unexpected hope came? So thinking about the flood, it really created an opportunity to be able to reframe that ecosystem in a way. Are there other examples of that? So I think that what happens every time a big event happens that brings me a lot of hope are the new partnerships that are formed. And so it's kind of avoiding your question, but I think the thing that gives me the most hope are people come together and you think that maybe they're going to be upset and it won't be a good time to join forces because people will be worried about their own individual concerns or stuff like that. But you see the incredible openness of human beings in times of challenge and the way that communities, people who maybe were having problems with each other before the event, are now really willing to let that go and work together. I think another example is one of the things that we're seeing in the climate manipulation experiment is that the invasive grass cheatgrass, or Bromus tectorum, is having really interesting relationships with both natural climate variability and the altered climate that we're providing in the experiment. And so what we're learning is that, at least from the experimental results, climate change could potentially, depending on how it occurs, be hard for that exotic invasive in a way that we could utilize in management. So we're noticing that it might be certain types of climates could be really challenging for something we don't want around, and maybe that will help native plants in their stress response to that change. So thinking about that. So I really like your question a lot, and I think it could be cool to try to create a place where we share those stories, where we're kind of unexpected benefits from things we would have first thought of as just bad have come out, and I think that could be a really neat way. So I'll write that down, and if you want to reach out to me later, we could think about making a website together or something like that where we share that. That's a great question. Yes, and then you.
Yes, I didn't see, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see the word crisis in your presentation. And I'm at the University of Utah, and just yesterday, the university, they sent out a weekly kind of news email, and there was an article headline, Extreme Climate Crisis. And I was just talking with a friend yesterday. I do think it can affect people's mental health using that kind of terminology. So I was just curious if you're presentation is intended as kind of an intervention to mitigate some of that language, or if you have an opinion, if that's the right terminology, or what are your thoughts about that?
So that's an excellent question. The question was that I didn't use the word crisis or the phrase climate crisis in my talk. Is that on purpose? Am I thinking about trying to mitigate or present something in contrast to that? And what are my thoughts on the use of crisis? So that's a really cool question. I definitely didn't use the word crisis on purpose. And I think that part of what was in the back of my mind when the title came out was some social media interactions that I saw happening where some people were saying how important it is to use words like crisis and kind of fearsome language because the problem is so large. And other people were saying it's scaring people, especially young people, and not having the effect. And I think the intended effect of using words like crisis is to wake us up. This is serious. We need to be taking action on this. And I think there's kind of a range of opinions on how you might do that, or if that kind of language or communication is effective. And so for me, in just my personal approach, I definitely see the logic behind language like that, and I understand, as a scientist who studies climate change, that it can feel scary and frustrating that we aren't seeming to take as much action as we could take on this front. And so I can see the pull to using language like that. I don't, in part because I don't find it effective in my communications. I find it more effective to talk about the seriousness of the issue, but to talk about how do we move forward. I think just saying, at least for me, saying to me like, uh-oh, we're in trouble, it doesn't, I just kind of like, well, I don't want to think, maybe I'll go to the movies. You know, that seems scary. I don't want to think about it, as opposed to, okay, we're in trouble and here's what we do. So I'm not suggesting people shouldn't use that language as they find it appropriate, but I don't find it effective in my communication, and I worry that it puts us to the part of the hope cycle I don't want us to be in, where we just feel overwhelmed and so we don't take action. And maybe there's a way to kind of blend some of that language with, and here's what we need to do about it now, more clearly. It's hard in social media where I was looking because there's such short blurbs of text, but it is on purpose, and I think I worry especially, so when I was putting together this talk after I foolishly gave the title, I was meeting with my research group a lot. I hadn't realized, and I have a lot of very young, people who have just graduated from college a couple years ago, as well as people at all career stages. But those young people, I hadn't realized how much anxiety they have about climate, how much they are internalizing this fear of climate change and thinking about decisions like whether they'll have children or not in this climate change context. And it made me realize how important our communication style is, and how we find ways to motivate us, not to sugarcoat the problem, to say that things are hard and what's our way forward, but also not to debilitate us with the feeling that the problem is so overwhelming and past the point where we can do anything about it. Does that answer you? Yeah, so I think it's really important thinking about how we talk about stuff. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that point is I think there's utility in talking about it in lots of different ways and for different reasons. And so this is the way that I do it for the goals that I have, but there's other effective ways too that I think are worth thinking about. But I think we should be explicit. What is our goal with the communication? And can we experiment with that different communication style to see what's the most effective? Yeah.
You answered already most of my questions, and I'm a social scientist, so actually I share a lot of anxiety you talk about, because everyday effort, sometimes I think, is it worth doing it? Because what you hear from media, and then that basically the sky's falling, it's too late. So I really like your framework of hope cycle, but I really, because I'm not an expert at all, so I just want to know someone from in the field that, because the rate of hopeful efforts and the outcomes you have described could revert the the detrimental effects of the climate changes? Because the rate of magnitude, because now we hear this too late, because I feel like clock is ticking, but maybe it's not true, but.
Yeah. Yeah, so excellent question, kind of about feeling that anxiety and feeling like, is it too late, but also are some of the suggested things that we could do just so small that are they even worth doing because they won't have a large effect? I think that's an excellent question. And I think the first part of my answer is, if it makes you feel better, it's worth doing no matter what. So if it reduces your anxiety and it's something good to do, there's no downside, I don't think, to doing it. But in the important part of that question too, which is, could it have an effect? I think it could have an effect if we all people started doing something. Anything we do would have a noticeable effect. I think that there are certain parts of the system that have much more leverage over those effects that we don't control as individuals, which is getting at what you're thinking I'm saying, or what I think you're saying. But I think that any actions that we take, and this kind of goes with your question, I think, instigates new ideas. It could turn into something that does have a big effect. And I think it will get us talking more and out and doing stuff more, and maybe we'll make it more clear to those bigger lever pullers that could have larger change how serious we are about this, as well as the kinds of changes that can occur that don't have to be, I think believing in climate change can be a money-making endeavor for the United States. The technology, the things that we can build. I don't think taking action on climate change means we have to sacrifice our economies, or, I think there's lots of ways forward in these different ways where we can consider, and this is what I really like about co-production, that if I just study the ecosystem and I'm not thinking about economies and laws and things you think about maybe more, and society and cultures, then I'm not very likely to come up with solutions that are going to be tractable at the larger scale. But I think by us actually doing things, it would show to at least the people who we spend time with that these are actions to be taken, and maybe to some of these bigger decision makers, and it could create new opportunities for change that could catalyze something larger. But even if it doesn't do any of those things, if it just makes me feel less anxiety, I want to do it. Because anxiety can be hard. Other questions? Yeah.
I was looking down there to see, so all of where the funding is coming from, pretty much all to be public, right? And governmental agencies. What about the private side and funding? Are you getting much help from there, or is that something you're hopeful about? Speaking about hope.
So yeah, always hopeful about research dollars. Excellent question. The vast majority of funding that we get are public dollars, are federal agency funding, which I think is in this country is probably the case for most people who study what I study, that they're getting funding from organizations like this, National Science Foundation, NASA, those kinds of things. I think there is a lot of opportunity for other kinds of funding, and at least for the science that we do, it would just be making sure that it didn't have any expectations on what the results might be, and that a reasonable person might not think, well, she's in that group's pocket now because she's getting funding. So one of the things I think that's more philosophically easy about national dollars are that's money to do science, you say what the results are, and there's no expectation that you wouldn't communicate honestly and clearly, which I think is true for all scientists. We go to school for like a decade after high school to make 1/100th of what people and lots of other big businesses make. So people are in it for the passion and the truth. But I think you wouldn't want it to seem or look like that you might have a bias in your interpretation of the data. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with startups right now, startup companies for carbon sequestration. And so, because there's money already to be made, you know, for kind of organizations want to say, well, we mitigated climate by having this much carbon go into the ground. And usually a way to do that can be to pay someone else who's putting the carbon into the ground. So these companies see the opportunities to be able to make money, as companies do, on this. And I think that's going to pump a lot of dollars into research from a diversity of sources that will be cool to see, you know, will be the kind of like Silicon Valley of carbon now kind of thing. But as a federal scientist, I think about not only, you know, getting research dollars for the science that I think is the most important and relevant, but also I would never want anyone to not feel comfortable with my ability to be unbiased in interpreting the data, because that's the most important thing to me. Yeah.
So I have a question about your pinyon juniper research, because I've looked a lot at aspen forests and how after fire, like, it's kind of scary because it's like the pretty forest is burning, but then in the long run it's like better for the forest. So I'm just curious, I'm not as familiar with pinyon juniper, but like, will your study be kind of long term to see if eventually they'll grow back, because they grow back a little differently? So I'm just curious, like, what you're...
Yeah, excellent question. So the question was, with the pinyon juniper study, are we going to keep looking at a longer term view of pinyon and juniper coming back post burn after fire? Because could it be that it's going to take a little bit longer? Definitely, yes. So we want to see, it's not at all that this is a window of time that it's like, now we know they're never coming back. We definitely still hope that they could come back even in the absence of management, and we will keep looking. The pinyon junipers do often have a fire cycle, so that it's not that fire doesn't come, but it's often more than 500 years or longer. So we've really ramped that fire cycle up, and that's part of what we're concerned about. More fire, more frequent fire, hotter fire. But we're definitely going to keep looking, and it could be that things are just taking longer than we've given them, and we'll be able to see that come back. So we've got our transect lines, and we'll keep running them, and we'll keep looking. We're also partnering in a cool way, kind of talking about the cultural side. Mesa Verde National Park has this incredible cultural resources side of staff. And they do lots of work out on the landscape looking for cultural resources, and if they need to put a new power line or water line, they go and look for everything to make sure that it doesn't compromise cultural resources in the park. And because they're so excited about this project, they've offered to start looking for pinyon juniper babies and burns for us too. So that's a lot more boots on the ground to be able to look at that. And we really want to up the area that we see. We're also doing a lot more work with drones and other types of remote sensing, which would allow us, if we can find a way, it can be hard to see a tiny, as you know, tree under grass or something, but if we could find hyperspectral or other types of detectors that might allow us to kind of pick that out, then we could scan huge areas with drone or airplane or satellite someday as the resolution gets better to try to look for that in burned areas. So great question. Any other questions? Yes.
These wonderful many people that you've listed there, are they representatives of the organizations you've listed below? Are they scientists? Are they contributors? Are they graduate students? What's the general background of the people you've listed?
Excellent. So the question is about the acknowledgements and who I've listed. What kind of groups do they represent? So they are scientists, they're land managers, they are graduate students, they are postdoctoral fellows. They are leadership in the U.S. Geological Survey, people who aren't actively doing research but who make decisions and lead us. They are university professors, a wide range of different folks focused on studying that. And it's just, I think, you know, as these issues become more and more in the news and the public, there's things we all think about. There's absolutely opportunities for everyone to get involved in this, to come out and help us plant babies, or just to share ideas over email. But I think this is a challenge we face together, and like I said, I really think our best hope comes from being able to all work together and share our ideas. I'm gonna get kicked off. Thank you all very much. Thank you.